The Illuminate Arts and Faith Conference in Chattanooga, Tennessee wants to help you find your tribe. Do you get way too excited about quoting Wendell Berry or C.S. Lewis in conversations with coworkers? Does your Spotify playlist include hymns, a little jazz, and a whole lot of Andrew Peterson? Join your tribe at Illuminate March 31 and April 1 for education and inspiration from speakers Russ Ramsey, Douglas McKelvey, John Hendricks, and others. Find a complete list of session topics and ticket information at southern.edu/illuminate.
In 2024, I set out to meet as many poets as I could and spend an hour with each one. I got more than I bargained for, more insight, more clarity, more hope. It's proved to be one of the richest highlights of my life. 17 writers, 17 deeply human conversations that made me sit up and pay attention. Franz Kafka once said, if the book we're reading doesn't wake us up with a blow to the head, what are we reading for? A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. And that's what I hope this new book will do. I hope it wakes us up, my friends. I hope these conversations will be the catalyst for something to be reawakened, re-enchanted, and reinvigorated. It's called An Axe for the Frozen Sea, Conversations with Poets About What Matters Most. I'm Ben Palpin, and I hope you'll come and listen in as I spend a little time with poets like Lucy Shaw, Malcolm Guite, Dana Gioia, and Lee Young Lee. Pull up a chair at the table as we dig into what it means to write well and to live well. An Axe for the Frozen Sea is now available from Rabbit Room Press. Visit the store at rabbitroom.com, or better yet, ask about it at your favorite bookseller.
And the way we played as children is what gets lost in so much of theater. And number one, it's fun. You don't take it too serious. But the magic of theater is caught in that little bit of imagination that we lived in so much as a child and have forgotten.
Welcome to the Habit Podcast, conversations with writers about writing. I'm Jonathan Rogers, your host. Besides being a novelist, Pete Peterson is a playwright and the head of Rabbit Room Theater. He's also the publisher at Rabbit Room Press. Matt Logan is the director, set designer, and costume designer who has brought all of Pete's plays to vivid life. Matt and Pete are putting the finishing touches on a new stage adaptation of Dickens's A Christmas Carol. Its inaugural run will be December 7th through December 22nd in Franklin, Tennessee. You can get your tickets at rabbitroom.com. Matt Logan, Pete Peterson, so happy to have you on the Habit Podcast to talk about A Christmas Carol, the play that you're putting on in Franklin, Tennessee, December 7th through December 22nd. Welcome.
That's right. Glad to be here.
Thank you.
I guess the first question is, why do we need another version of A Christmas Carol?
That's a good question. I think it's one of the most adapted things maybe in the English language. So why do we need another one? I like to make the joke that, over the course of my life, I've loved the book and I've seen multitudes of different adaptations, everything from the Muppets to, George C. Scott and others. And all of them have disappointed me in one way or another.
Even the Muppets, huh?
Yeah, even the Muppets is a little disappointing in some ways. So I like to joke that I'm writing my own version now to disappoint people in a whole new way.
Listen, I saw the preview. I was not disappointed, I have to say. Maybe you are going to do the disappointing parts later, but the part I saw was amazing.
Well, I hope we live up to the trailer. But the point, though, is that, I'm not trying to disappoint people, obviously. Yeah. But I think the reality of any kind of adaptation is that, when you have a beloved book, everybody's experience of that book is a little different. Everybody loves different things about it. And so inevitably, when you see somebody else adapt it, they make different choices. And this particular show is, I guess, my experience of the imaginary world of A Christmas Carol.
Mm-hmm. And I like to look at a little, slightly more positive spin. But kind of the same essence is, I remember in college, I had a great, a wacky, but a very great educator that said, they were doing a master class, came in and basically said, what's the difference between you and when I was tackling a role? And they were, and they listed the icons that have done it originally that we knew it from. And I was like, what, that I'm nothing and these people are incredible? He goes, no, the difference is it's your turn. So in a way, we don't have to put down any other view to just say, I think it was time. And I think it is time that Pete and I as a collective have our turn.
Yeah. That's a great point. I mean, that's what we do. That's what stories are, right? Like it's these things that humans do and have done for thousands of years. We read all these stories, and every time they take on subtly new meanings and perspectives, and that's part of what makes them powerful.
Yeah. And I mean, like most of the stuff that Pete and I dream about and have done in the past is, for Pete, it's the enormous weight of adaptation. But for me, it's like, I want to hear your take. I want your take on this.
Yeah.
I want to do my take, but I also want to hear what Pete has to say. And time again, through the work that we have done, I call it the turning of a prism. We're just looking at the same thing. We're just looking through a different lens. Mm-hmm. And I have benefited, and I've been grateful to see audiences benefit from what started as Pete at the page. So,
yeah. And that's mutual too, because like when I start writing, like I can't wait to see what Matt is going to do with this stuff, because I know that his version of it is going to be its own unique vision.
Yeah. I guess, by the way, I neglected to say what your respective roles are in this process. So
how dare you?
So Pete, you're the writer.
I am indeed. And producer.
And what would you add? I mean, is that the whole,
so I'm the artistic director of Rabbit Room Theater. I'm the playwright behind this particular adaptation of A Christmas Carol, and I'm producing the show.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And Matt, you're the director.
I'm the director and the scenic designer, costume designer, and producing, as well as pulling the artists that I have long relationships with that have joined the bandwagon over at Rabbit Room.
The Merry Band.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know. I love seeing these actors, in their different roles through the years. It's been so fun.
Yeah. We're really, it's something that's happened. If I just focus on the Rabbit Room Theater portion, it says it a lot, but it goes much deeper than that. Is basically, we're just grateful that the best actors in this area have been available. Mm-hmm. And even when some of our faves are pulled in other directions, we have a great list that we have to shuffle. Yeah. But the shuffle is possible because the rich, incredible talent. And, I don't know if people know, this could be a whole chapter we get stuck on, but the process of workshopping a piece and the burden that the actor carries as they walk into a workshop is very different from just a piece that's done. I mean, these actors, when they work into a workshop, you kind of say to them, it's like, we need you to carry the fact that we don't know everything.
Yeah.
We need your input. We need you to fill in the gaps and make this real. And then you inspire the direction and the design. And then you inspire the writer to re-edit. And through the dialogue and conversation, because they're the first people to be in it. And so as they're in it, they're like, I don't understand what I'm doing. And we're like, great. We need to answer that. And at some points, it's me clarifying. Other points, Pete goes, no. Let me go back. I can line this up and that up. And that is actually the joy, if we really put a nutshell around a hallmark around it, is that for so many years I've worked with finished material. That you've struggled to try and give a new interpretation through the finished, like you got to keep that period where the period is.
Yeah.
And really the goal is not to change it as much as just to make it feel fresh. But the power of new interpretation, especially with the writer in the room, is that you get to influence. And that's both a burden and it's a burden. It's scary. It's sometimes you're like, oh, I don't want to influence this in the wrong direction either. So there's always that evaluation. And so luckily Pete has very thick skin and sits among our readings and our talks and gives me the freedom to speak freely.
Yeah.
I don't have to worry about, if I say this, what if I'm going down a rabbit hole that's really wrong? And Pete will just sit there and go, okay. And he just like absorb it. And then we just see it on the page.
Yeah.
And I love that, because I can say, I need more of this. We need more of that. We need this. And you talk about things, and he's gleaning it, and he's not taking it verbatim from me. He's really sifting it through the lens, because honestly, I love the discovery. And sometimes I don't even discover what he's nestled in the script until we're in rehearsal.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm like, you had this all along? You knew this little corner? So, yeah.
Matt, and I had never thought about the difference between, you sending off, and ordering scripts for all your actors. I know there are these companies, especially for school plays, that you go and you get your, Finding Nemo Jr. or whatever, and then you've got the script, and then you got to figure out what to do with it. It's so different from what you're doing with what you've done with Pete. Now, is this the fourth time?
Uh-huh.
The fourth time that one of them has been produced is actually, there's another one we've tinkered with that is still.
No, we Matt and I were talking about that before. We might circle around back to that one.
What's interesting to me though, Jonathan, is like, this is like what Matt's talking about here. The workshop process is, it's the editorial process in theater. Uh-huh. And it's interesting to me because I'm not only a playwright, like I'm an author too. It would be interesting to write a novel with this kind of process. Like, I don't know how that would work, but like, it would be like, you would have to imagine sitting in a room while a group of people read your novel aloud and then argued about what they did and didn't like about it, what you should or shouldn't have done, how it could be better. And then you take all of that information back into the process and you do it over and over and over again with the intent that you come out with the leanest, most efficient, pithiest version of this thing that you're trying to write. And it kind of makes me wish that that's how novels were written. And I know the editorial process is like that in some way, but by the nature of its medium, it's just a very different thing. But it's a lot of fun.
Yeah. Pete, since there's a finite pool of actors who are most likely going to be acting these plays that you write, are you writing with particular people in mind for these roles? I mean, I guess you obviously you haven't cast before you write, but.
Yeah, that's a good question. There's a couple of shows, this show and the last show, The Hiding Place, we did from the beginning know who the lead was going to be.
Okay.
And so that was kind of an opportunity, like, because I knew those two actors, it was an opportunity to understand how they would deliver something and write for that. Mm-hmm. But I would say overall, because you don't know that going in, that's part of why the workshop process is so valuable. Mm-hmm. Because, we have to be really careful when we invite actors into a workshop. We have to be clear that, hey, we're not casting right now. We just really trust your instincts to help us figure this out. But there's also a sense in which I'm seeing how a certain person does a certain role, and I'm really enjoying that. And maybe I start tinkering with the role and the dialogue based on the way that they deliver it. And, maybe that person ends up getting cast or not. So sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. That's a very complicated process. But it is delightful to watch how people deliver things and how people interpret things. And that will often shift subtly the trajectory that I saw for the character. And then I can kind of rewrite toward that. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I did not understand that you were workshopping before you cast the play.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And so this show, I think we did what, four workshops and a reading, maybe? I don't know. Like, it was a lot.
Probably more than that, but yeah.
Okay. I never understood. Maybe walk us through the process of how this happens from Pete writing through to production.
That's So I guess let's just take the Christmas Carol as our example.
Great.
And at some point, Matt and I decided, let's do a Christmas Carol. I'll write a new adaptation, and I think we've got some new ideas. Let's see if we can pull it off. So then the first process is that I have to go, create something. I think this one I wrote in the space of about a month, the first draft. Sat down with Dickens' work, read it enough to like fully intuit it to the point that I feel like I can begin regurgitating it in my own way. And then we get a first draft. And that actually begins at the most granular level with me and my wife, Jennifer, sitting down at the kitchen table. I print the script out and we read through it together. Because, like, unlike a novel, you really don't know what you've got on your hands until you've read it out loud with a play. So I have to hear it out loud to hear, like, okay, this is what the pacing's like. This is what the voices are like. This is what's working. This is what's not. And I'll go through that process just between me and Jennifer 3 or 4 times before I ever take it to a larger group. But basically, my goal is to get to the end of what I think I can do without hearing it presented by a chorus of voices. So when I've done all I can do and made it the best I can, then I call Matt and I'm like, hey, let's get a reading together. And then we start casting around for like who we want to invite. And sometimes it's, I think this person might be good for this role. Let's try that out. Sometimes it's just, hey, this person is super talented and really versatile and that they can cover a wealth of different things. So we sit down in a room, we pass out scripts, and I'm pretty silent. I don't say much of anything. And I let it go wherever it needs to go. And then at the end of it, again, I try to be mostly silent. And Matt, do you want to talk about how you kind of lead that discussion that happens at the end of that?
Sure. A lot of it is digging. I think of it like tilling the soil. We sometimes we'll just, I think the first time we did this one, we just read it through. We didn't stop and start. We kind of gave a beginning and we just said, we need to hear this. It was some of these actors, it was some that aren't, that are our treasured friends that were not, it wasn't really a show for them. We didn't know that at that point. They're great people. And so we got around and we read it for the first time. And then we just took reactions. And I was just like, what's your thought? And it was a lot of people. So a little bit of the backstory is that I've done this show 5 times.
Okay.
4 professionally, and was really proud of the work.
Not this version of it, but
not Pete's script. It was a different script and we were very proud of the whole experience. And the last one was 10 years ago, so it was a while. And I knew that kind of loving where we landed and we finished. And one of the reasons I stopped doing it 10 years ago, I was so proud of where we got. So it was like, I don't want to remount this next year and have to be lesser. So as we approached this, for me, it was a different experience than when we've done Hiding Place or Frankenstein or Battle of Franklin. I needed to forget. I needed to be like, I don't need the things that I'm used to. And I say that because as we started the discussion, I needed the cast, and many of them were a part of that, to forget as well. So hearing their responses of like, what is this? Like, what's that? What, oh, that was so interesting here. And really having some very educated, very familiar voices chime in was helpful. And I think where Christmas Carol is different is we were so familiar with it that it was interesting to, whereas past shows, we were walking and going, wait, I'm just reading this the first time. Did I hear that correctly?
Yeah.
And this was a very different experience, but it was good because I think the feedback we got from everyone is this feels different and in a good way.
Yeah.
And
so Matt, are you saying that some of the actors in this show were in your Christmas carols from years ago, 10 or 12 years ago? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Including Chip, who was.
Okay.
And
were they like what? Chip was Tiny Tim last time you did it?
Yeah. Right. He was Scrooge. But it was a weird thing to kind of go, okay, we don't have to say we're not fixing what's broken in a sense for our minds. We are shifting gears. And even for me as a designer, I was like, I don't want to jump to conclusions. Typically a first read, I'm immediately getting visions and I want to go with that. Yeah. And here it was like, I'm trying to forget what I've done multiple times to give room for something new to come forward. And in many ways, it wasn't hard to understand Pete's slant and his newness. We've gone through many iterations, and I think in this iteration, what we've landed was really wanting to pull. I'm pulling more in what I call the grandeur of British theater, and then when you look at Pete's work in particular, it is. I feel like deepening what in a novella is so skims the surface.
Mm-hmm.
And so that, yeah, so we were at that process, and it was interesting to sort of walk through the room and just ask questions. What do you think about this? What do you think about that? Is there enough of this? Is there enough of that? And I kind of say all the things that Pete doesn't want to say. Because when you're a creator, like, I know this, when I go into fittings, I don't want to be like, I would be very different if I was an outside person. I'd be like, that doesn't fit there. What's going on there? Why is that not lined up? But as the person who did it, I'm like, I'm not going to say all that.
Yeah.
I want to hear if other people see the flaws or not in the own work. And then I know the things that I'm going to advance, and I know the things that I'm prioritizing. So I like to hear people's reaction, whether it feels educated or not, because they are a sense of an example of the audiences we're going to get. They come from all walks of life and all different fields. So I like to ask questions that can feel dangerous, and say, let's knock it around for a minute, because I really feel like this goes to writing, but I feel like in life, truth should not be fearful to debate. If it's truth, we can knock it around the room for hours and we're going to land on truth. But if you knock it around for 10 minutes and it starts falling apart. And so
Matt, can you give me an example of the kind of thing you say or ask that Pete, as the playwright, wouldn't be comfortable saying and asking?
Oh yeah. Does it work?
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, like, you don't want to say that when it's, and Pete's actually really great at taking such horrible criticism. And we'll have a time where one actor will go off for 20 minutes about what doesn't work, and you're like, they're not right.
Yeah.
We're not taking that. And that's okay.
But often, what my experience though is often when that happens, it's not necessarily that the person giving the criticism is well, I trust that the person giving the criticism is sensing something that's off, even if they aren't diagnosing it in a way that I agree with. So that's actually usually pretty exciting to me as a writer, because then I get to go back and think, okay, what is it that they're feeling that isn't quite right? And how can I address that in a creative way of my own that solves that issue in some way that nobody was expecting?
And I think that insight is so important. That when you're giving feedback, your job is really to say, here's what I'm experiencing, not to diagnose the problem, not to come up with a solution, but rather say, this isn't working for me. Now, Pete, go figure it out.
And he's pretty good at if he feels like, okay, I need you to say more, because I don't want to solve it. Like, he doesn't need me to write a line in this play. Do you know what I mean? And he doesn't need the actors to either. He does need us to go, this is not, and that was a lot of when you take novella to a show, having done this show before, that was very straight to the novella. I know the corners that were like trouble, because on stage, you've got to, you don't cut to like you can in film. You can't cut in mid conversation. They got to walk on, like you have to give them something, and these actors need to know okay, you may pick these 5 lines of this conversation, but what was the conversation? So you've got to paint it to then edit it in a lot of ways. And sometimes when you get really great writers, in some senses, or great tried and true text, there's something about that you don't need the full context. It works. It makes sense. And I even think there's that scene in Hiding Place, Pete, that Matt and Nan did in the office, the food stamps office, the ration cards. And man, that scene could work at a standalone. It just is beginning, middle, and an end all over and you end somewhere very different. It is so well written, that scene. And I think the hard part is when you jump to Christmas Carol, there's such wisps. It's like the ghost is taking you here and you're here and here. And so it is back and forth of, do we need to unpack more, or do we need to edit more? Do we need more information? Do we need the ghost to say a line and then we don't need anymore? Somehow the audience needs to be carried. and need to be directed, but it can be done in so many different ways. Whereas like Hiding Place was a little more linear in its scene work. It didn't have ghosts. It didn't have interruptions of spirits, and even time. And this I don't mean to give away anything, but this interpretation that Pete brings, the spirit life is ever present. And we had so many discussions with the actors. What is the spirit life? We've got to create. What is that world? How do they interact? What is the tone? Are they? And so, luckily, that's where our actors have been huge in interpreting that and knocking it around and really figuring it out. So it really was a lot of back and forth on that subject alone. How do we start this? What world are we entering? And then how do we shift?
Funny that I feel like every show we work on, we rewrite the beginning 18 times.
Of course.
And, it's so hard, the beginning. I don't know why beginnings are hard for me, but but what is so valuable about the process for me? And let me elucidate a little bit, like when we say a workshop, like in theater terms, I think it's called a 29-hour workshop, 28-hour workshop. But effectively what we do is we'll sit down Monday morning and read through the script, talk about it. Monday afternoon, read through the script, talk about it. And then I go home and I'll spend all day Tuesday coming up with a new draft. So I address all of those pain points and anything else that I took away from the process, and I rewrite it. I come back Wednesday morning with fixes for all of it. And we do the whole process again. And then I go home, and Thursday, I'm rewriting again. And then we do it Friday, and I come out of Friday with a lot of good stuff to go home and work on. And every time we do that, it's amazing to see how quickly and effectively the show evolves. Like a really intense, stressful process, but I love it at the same time that I dread it. I mean, it's a lot of pressure, but there is no doubt about the fact that the show just becomes a different animal every time.
Yeah.
And every time.
All right. We have kind of stalled. We've kind of stalled out on the workshop. We've got to move this thing along. So workshop, that was really helpful, by the way. I thought I understood how workshops work. That was more than I understood. So what happens next? We've got the workshop. You've done the rewrites, Pete.
Yep.
Now what?
Well, and then a lot of the measures is where I start going through and I'm like, hey, we're going to need to change this word or that word just because the set won't have that. Let's not make it about that. And we even have discussions right now where I'm like, Pete, can you just not say that, and then we don't have to have it.
Another great example is that, I had originally written this with a couple of songs in mind, and the songs are actually written, but I don't think they're going to make it into the show, just for practical reasons, So even though I wish they were there, that wish may be right, may be wrong, but the practical realities of production are that, they're not going to make it.
Pete, if you'd like to sing them, we could add that as kind of a bonus episode of this podcast.
Nothing would terrify me more.
Well, I liken it to this when you start talking about to production, from script even, and it is very similar to writing. I don't have to. Pete understands writing and editing so well that I don't have to push this with him. But in general, when I'm working with other writers and people, I'm like, do not rush the wild phase. You've got to be in the wild phase. You've got to write too many scenes. You've got to go down all the little angles you want to, even if they're cut. You need to do all that. You need to get it out.
Yeah. And forget about efficiency at this point.
And then we can edit. But if you edit before you've done the wild phase, you're too linear. It's too stuck. You've not been creative, and in a weird way, you become cliche because you've kind of viewed it from an audience standpoint while you're creating it, instead of bringing in things that nobody saw coming, and then suddenly it's a whole new thing. So for me, that works the same way as it turns into the physical. I think even when we looked at Battle of Franklin, I think I told Pete's like, wait, so I have to do a battle And we have how many people? And even with each script, I was like, so we don't have 40 people on stage. Like,
I think when I had originally written it, it was like, the Union Army charges across the stage.
Yeah.
I'm like, okay. So, but then we start whittling. I don't want to ever stop his creativity because I like the things. Me as an artist in staging and in design and all that, I kind of love it not being already conformed to a stage piece, because then we find some of the most exciting things. When we go to Battle of Franklin, one of my favorites was the General Hood sequence that was a monologue about what happened that then built the art, the chase that was landing on Franklin in the Civil War. And in the middle of the play was this story about General Hood and why he is now descending. And we did it with a chair and like 8 people to create what that was. And it was one of the most artistically thrilling
I love
little pieces that if we had gone back to it, or if a writer had even said, I'm going to start limiting myself, so I don't have people, so I can't tell that. Well, maybe someone could say, well, what I remember. And then you're like, oh, you lost all of everything, Yeah. So in a weird way, you want to create those challenges that then become a knot to unravel, to quote Pete. But then there are other times where I got to come back and go, okay, we just can't do that. So is there a weird way? Can we just alter this, and then now we're fine?
Yeah.
And still keep the story.
That's part of what's interesting to me about stage writing is, the stage direction portion is where technically I shouldn't have a lot to say. Like things that I have to say should be in the dialogue primarily, which isn't, entirely true. It's not all one thing or the other, but I enjoy the kind of delicate dance of what do I suggest and how does the director interpret it? And sometimes, that can be like a really dramatic suggestion that I don't see any way as possible. And then Matt will turn around and figure out an abstract way of making that thing possible that's so much better than I had ever imagined. So I really resist the temptation to get really concrete in stage directions, because in my experience, like that's where a great director really gets to exercise his or her craft by working in between the lines, and if I'm too concrete about that, I'm shutting that down, and that's not fun.
Yeah. So good. So we're in set design mode now. Is that the stage we're in?
Set design. It's costume design. It's staging. It's really turning what was a literary piece on the page into a physical.
Yeah.
And that's also the place where if I read on the first page of a script that I was being asked to do, that it is completely in reality, everything realistic, and they're in the base of an airplane, and then there's chickens, and then a baby comes through, and I'm like, I'm done. I don't care how good it is. I'm not doing that. If you want me to do that challenge, forget it, because all the time and energy is like becoming traffic cop to try and make that real. But when we're in a space, which Pete writes so well for me, of I've jokingly called the world. Somebody asked me a long time ago, like, what is your style? And I'm like, how can I know my style? Like, I just do what I feel. I don't know what that is. I don't put it in a box and contain it. But then it made sense to me when I finally said, it sounds silly and it sounds very Cracker Barrel, but I think my style is like Grandma's attic. I think, and when we were kids and we play in Grandma's attic, like everything was possible in that attic. And you'd open a trunk and there's this, and then you'd throw on a coat and it's this. And the way we played as children is what gets lost in so much of theater. And number one, it's fun. You don't take it too serious, but the magic of theater is caught in that little bit of imagination that we lived in so much as a child and have forgotten.
Yeah.
So that is what I want. Any sense of style that I have is always that. So there are things that people see in my set design, and they're like, oh yeah, of course, you're always doing this and that. And I'm like, sure. But you can call it a style, but it's also certain ways to return to a language that we've been able to take something very mundane and it feels very magical. And even as we started to stage some of this in the way we transferred Scrooge from the boy to the man and trying to play with the jacket. Now, how does the jacket transfer that then opens it with the words that Pete's saying? And much like that General Hood monologue. And those are the places to me that really become, it's so simple, but yet it feels magical. And when it's the thing that's lost in Broadway when they bring in machinery. And now the machinery's there. And it's the same thing you can do with projections or on film where you're suddenly like, oh, well, if you can go to the Sahara Desert, then you don't need poetic.
Yeah.
So when you can whittle it down to the fact that we can bring the feeling, how do we bring the feeling? Even as we were doing workshops where we had them doing like, shh, we had all the actors doing that. I think they did that at the reading that you saw. We're probably not going to have them do that on the stage, but it did bring a sense of playfulness, sound effect. One actor over here was like, oh, if I do my water bottle like this, it sounds like a bell. And like, great. But that is the magic of theater, that if we turn that off, everything is so checklist. But when you bring it to life, it is amazing the imagination that comes to play and the vivid, because we know it as children. Every single one of us have been that stage. Now, whether we lost it earlier than others is the question, but it is so known. And I really think that's where the audience benefit the most. So turning it from pages to that, we want to both go, okay, we need enough for them to feel wowed and excited. But we also need to limit ourselves so that our imagination is really ignited and infused. Because I've seen everything from, people being a puppet. Why is that puppet more real than anything else on stage? And it's only, and then you've seen bad versions too, but what is that makes it? And it truly is a stage magic. It goes back to storytelling, but it's taking the storytelling from word base to now feelings, emotions, moods, sounds, sound effects.
Yeah. That reminds me, Matt, one of my favorite part about rehearsals is because I continually rewrite right up until opening night. It drives actors crazy sometimes. But like what's interesting to me is like, I can write a scene that I think is beautiful and it can work great in a reading. But then if we get into rehearsal, like often we realize, hey, you don't need those two lines. Like we see what's going on stage now. Let's just cut those lines. And the more that can happen, the better things get, I think. There's no reason to say something if the audience can already see it happening. And so I love that process of watching it to come together and continually figuring out how do we shave this down to its, most essential essence.
Yeah, so different from in your novels. If you don't write it, it's not there.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
But I also love the way they can work in tandem. I mean, it's one of the things that when I first heard about Pete through our friend Evie, and I was looking for a writer, and she said, I know he hasn't done stage, but have you read his words? Yeah. And in the preface alone, I was so captivated by his language.
In The Fiddler's Gun.
In The Fiddler's Gun. And the poetry with which he wrote, the vividness. Yeah. And it is something that when we have done, like, I've even read some of his scripts and that Pete's like, no, I don't want to say anything. I just want it to happen. And I was like, I need Pete's words. I need your words. Like, I need you to write me a monologue. I need you to write this. He's like, I don't want to. And I'm like, no, it is a gift.
Yeah.
It is a poetic gift that you have. And there are pieces in this current script that I am bewitched by.
Yeah.
And I know the original and I love Dickens, but honestly, I've heard the same sense of words so many times that when Pete just turns a phrase or adds a little bit that extends, suddenly the hairs stand up on your arm in tandem with Dickens.
Yeah.
And it is, Pete said that he's like, it was an indulgence for him to get wrapped up into this riddle with Charles Dickens to weave this show. And you really get that sensibility. And he comes up with phrases that I am in love with. I absolutely, it is the same poetry, but it is of Pete's world and his words. But he's found a way of channeling that time, but yet giving us, it's interesting. I've done this before with a show that was, people knew it too well. They just know it too well. I mean, how many times have people watched this movie and everything? Our power is in our interpretation. And if we just bow down to the original, then it works I feel the same way about Shakespeare. It has been done too many times. And when someone says to me, in the original full text, I'm like, goodbye. Because it really means that it's like we said back to our earlier thing, what is your turn? And I don't mean butcher, because people have.
Yeah.
But honestly, that is what, even go back to what Pete said, where he's like, and now it's where I'll offend other people. We do take on the burden of what some could view as butchering something that they hold so dear. But honestly, I liken it to, I'm going to go back to Grandma's attic world, because that's where I live. I liken it to Dad has a gorgeous tuxedo, gorgeous, beautiful tuxedo that was handmade. It is perfection. And we're so scared of it that we just leave it in a box. No, it needs to be worn. It needs to be carried. And does that mean it will rip and wear? Yes. So in a way, as we get this chestnut out and we all try it on again, it is going to wear and tear in moments, but it's also going to be better in moments, because we can't just look at something and say, that story has been told. Like, imagine if we said that Hamlet has been told. Goodbye. We close the door on Hamlet forever. Yeah. That is not story. That's not what this art from the ancient Greeks around a fireplace that started from. That is not the power. So what we have done in this show, starting with Pete and then handing off to me in the design world, is we're trying to find a place that we are both 100% of the age in which it was written, but we are today as well. We have to be today. And I don't mean that someone has an iPhone. That's cheap. I'm talking about a sensibility, the way we think. In Dickens' time, the way
we recognize ourselves in the show. Yeah.
And I think Dickens, for the Victorian time, I mean, think of what therapy was in Victorian time. There wasn't. Nobody even knew these words. It wasn't in the 30s. People didn't even know how to say therapy. But when you look at his work, and Pete recognized it immediately, the ghosts are like therapists. I mean, they're truly letting him work through his trauma, his pain, the places that he needs to make amends. I mean, it's therapy in the most beautiful form. And I think that is something that is so beautifully embraced in today's world. And I think Pete brought that sensibility to it, that we can really work through our trauma. And so that I think someone of today could go, wow, I had the Christmas cheer because I saw Scrooge and Bob Cratchit and their sweet family. But I also had a new perspective of my own experience.
Yeah. Okay, we got to wrap this thing up. So here's the question that y'all are, I hope this isn't too hard to answer on the fly, but Matt, you introduced the idea that a story that's been told and retold, now it's your turn, right? We're entering into a conversation that's been going on for a long time, and you've got something to add to the conversation, and that's why you're doing this. I would love to hear Pete talk about what Matt adds to the conversation that's distinctly Matt. And I'd like to hear Matt talk about what Pete adds to the conversation that's distinctly Pete. Yeah. Y'all work together enough that y'all have a good sense of who the other is, which also means, maybe it means you've worked together so long that it's hard to distill it into an answer.
Yeah.
But if you'd give it a try, I'd love to hear the answer to that question.
I would love to try. I think Matt's probably got the easier version of that answer because like I work in words and Matt works in shapes and colors.
Everything else. Yeah.
But one of the things that I adore about Matt's shows is his sense of color, his sense of the emotional coherence of a show. Like right away when we started working together, I was delighted to learn that he's hard against ever seeing lights down, scene change, lights up, the show goes on. Like that is not how it works. Like this thing should be a seamless emotional narrative experience. And the creativity that he brings to how to accomplish that is like a mystery and a wonder to me. And then I'll add to that I've had the great benefit of being able to, for many years now, sit and watch him work as a director. I selfishly used to think, man, I should be a director. I could direct. And I thought that only until I saw Matt do it, and then really quickly realized this is not something I can ever do. And what I mean by that is like he's such an empathetic person that he's able to work with this vast cast of people that are coming from all these different places and draw out of them incredible things. And my version of that would be, hey, you say the words like I wrote them, stop doing whatever that thing is you're doing. Say it like this.
Yeah.
And that is not what a director does. A director draws out of a person their own choices about how to make the show the best that it can be. And watching his ability to do that is really incredible. And then you couple both of those things, I think, with his appreciation for truth and like really wanting to get at the truth of a thing, of the humanity of a thing, and to accurately represent what is the kernel of this that really represents the core of what it means to be human in the world. And he's got a great sense for whether or not that mark is being hit. And that gives me a great deal of confidence that when I hand a script to him that I have wrestled over and probably cried over and I've poured my heart and soul into, that it's in good keeping, because I think he's going to understand what's at its heart.
Yeah.
And I think that those are all really beautiful, rare traits. And then on top of that, he's not just a director, he's a scenic designer. So he designed these beautiful sets that are they're not realistic per se. They're abstract works of art that, especially in the context of Frankenstein, I remember I saw his kind of vision on paper and I was like, yeah, okay, I guess I get that. But then to see it on stage under lights is incredible. And I love that he had that in his mind the whole time and knew what could be accomplished with that sketch on a paper where it began. And then he's the costume designer, and his costumes are glorious and wonderful. And the first time I ever met Matt, I was over at a friend's house and peeked in the other room, and there was just this guy in there sewing a dress. And I was like, so what does he do? And she was just like, he sews dresses.
Usually the set design, costume design is a separate job from the director, correct?
Yeah. So Matt wears a lot of hats.
Yeah.
Which is part of what I think it makes his shows unique. They are a very clear personal expression of his imagination.
Yeah. Before we go to Matt, Pete, tell me one thing that would surprise me about the work of a director, something that you didn't know maybe, or that you think people don't usually know about what a director does.
Well, I think the big one for me is you don't ever give an actor a line reading. You don't ever say to an actor, no, do it like this. It's more a conversation of trying to help the actor arrive at the best choice on their own, which is actually a lot like marriage.
I was about to say, it sounds like therapy.
But I think, it is a lot like therapy, I think. And a lot of what goes on in rehearsals sounds a lot like therapy. Which is not a bad thing. It's how we arrive at the emotional truth of a situation and deploy it in front of an audience in the way that they can recognize. And I can say, me, Jonathan, that's not what I'm good at, I don't think. And I'm grateful to be surrounded by other people who have those talents.
Yeah, it's really cool. And I don't know before we get to Matt, I have one more question that I don't know if either one of you can answer this. I have a clear idea of what a Christmas color is supposed to look like. I've seen enough versions of it. Can you say anything about what's going to surprise us? Or without, I don't know, if you can answer that question in some way, like what are you bringing to the look that we're all familiar with that's distinct, or that again, I'm not asking you to spoil what it's going to.
I think there is a sense in which we're anxious to see what that is too.
Okay.
We're still building.
Still building it.
But
I can't wait to see the big chandelier fall down to the ground. That's going to be so
the
cool.
opera. Great. Great.
But I do think, like, we have a big vision for the show. Like, I love what we're trying to achieve, and I hope that the audience enjoys that as much as I have enjoyed seeing it develop. We're working with Laura and Tony Matula, who are filmmakers that we always partner with on our shows for, trailers and artwork and posters and that kind of thing. And Tony's developing some projections that we're going to use in artful ways throughout the show that I'm really excited to see how that develops.
Yeah.
In addition to, Stephen Moss, who does has done the lighting design on all of my shows, is just a absolute masterful painter with light. I'm really, whatever set Matt designs, by the time Stephen layers his colors and his palette and his magic on top of it, it just elevates the entire experience. And so I have no doubt that what's going to show up on stage is going to be a feast for the eye.
Yeah. I don't think I'd be giving away too much, and if I am, we can cut it out. But the idea of the spirit world existing, being ever present, that y'all are working with, I think is so interesting, because there's something about the way it's normally done. It feels like you got Victorian England, then you got, then we fly off to the spirit world for a little while, and then we come back to Victorian England. And I love the fact that the way the spirit world is clearly, it's just on the other side of a little veil all the time.
Yeah. Well, nothing in life cuts us to the quick and make us evaluate the present like the loss of precious people in our lives. Yeah. And the ever presence of them is something that we never talk about.
Yeah.
And we don't know if it's them. We don't know what. There's a mystery. There's a veil. And I think Pete is dancing with the veil in this piece in a way that really cuts us pretty quick. Yeah. And what I love, when you ask about the traditional and how will this be different in some ways, is when you hear God bless us everyone at the end of the play, it is not a anthem for lifting your stein in the air. It is one that will probably make people burst into tears out of joy and out of transformation.
Yeah. I also love the image of Pete dancing with veils. Pete doing the dance of the seven veils, totally. But okay, Matt, tell us about what Pete adds to the world.
Well, the interesting thing is that, first of all, it's the world on this piece, or just in general?
Just in general. But answer that however you want to. Because the question is, as you join the conversation, it's your little thing that you have to add that justifies your repeating, telling the same story again.
Yeah. He, time and time again, even in the 4 shows we've done, he, like Frankenstein, I was like, hey, I just saw a piece of Frankenstein and it didn't wow me. And he's like, I would love to tell that because it's not being told properly. And I'm like, then let's do it.
Yeah.
I didn't even know what he was going to say. I'm like, I don't even know what you mean. And that's kind of what I love, the trust factor I have for him when it comes to storytelling, and with how I say he's a wordsmith, but how he says it. In the same way that I like to create pictures and I like to create poetry and I like to do things that move people, I cannot do that with words. I mean, like he said about directing, I've tried writing before and I'm like, I can come up with scenarios and I have inner life, I know, but I should never put pen to the page. It is not my gift. I'm a picture person. I am not a word person. And every time we get to these things, I'm like, oh, I think Pete should say something. He just says it in such a beautiful way. I mean, I can have a conversation, but he has conversation, but even more, he puts it on the page for us to hold and come back to. And I encourage everyone who has seen one of Pete's scripts on stage to go back and read them. Mm-hmm. It's another experience. And so when I do use the words of like, I liken him in my own mind to Shakespeare, which I know everyone, ha, ha, ha. Mm-hmm. I do, because I both want to sit with those words and I also want to experience them. And that is rare for a writer. And for Pete, you want both. You really want the context, and then you need to go sit alone with those words and think about them, because he has thought so specifically about his, and he uses words from other times that other people don't even know these words. I don't even know them until he says them. And then I'm like, oh, that it in the same way that Pete writes for different eras is like when you hear a violin and suddenly you're so moved by the Holocaust. Mm-hmm. It's that same tie that we have with locations and places and pieces that he's able to so quickly pick up on. And then I don't know, a lot of times I think Pete doesn't do it on purpose, but he says when he taps into truth, he's saying truth from such a core place that the rings, the ripples from that start echoing into other realities. And what I mean by that is kind of like what I'm saying with the God bless us everyone at the end of the show. He took a piece about an old curmudgeon and made it about how we in our lives learn how better to love and accept ourselves and others in life. Yeah. And how Scrooge was a man that was all about the coin, and he was whittled down to no one has worth. And then suddenly in these moments and in these scenes, it's revealed our fellow man's worth. Yeah. I mean, and as we started to, Pete, I know you know the scenes that I'm talking about, as we started to unpack them, we're like, what? Yeah. This was just a street scene with nothing, and it's turned into a jewel for humanity.
Yeah,
and yet, and so this is time and time again that even when he took that speech that you wrote in Frankenstein, where the monster is like, "Why don't I have these joys? Why are you allowed this and I am not?" And the things it was huge. And I've even had dear friends after they saw Frankenstein just sent me a text and said, I am rocked to my core.
Yeah. Yeah.
They didn't say, oh, what a great horror film that was, or, I love the monster. And that they were like, my heart is broken and you're teaching me to learn to love better. And that's at the core, I think, of so much of what Pete writes. And he's not a mushy person. Mm-hmm. He's not a cliche person. And I love that about him.
Yeah.
And we argue about that stuff all the time, because sometimes I'm like, I need it to be a little clearer.
Yeah.
And he's like, no, I want the mystery. I want the mystery. Yeah, I'm like, right. I love the mystery, but most of our audience need a little more hand holding than that. No, I don't want to go all the way.
Yeah.
But they need some to just follow the path. Yeah. So let's just get them to the path. Let's not answer it for them. So I really, it is a joy every time we get to start a new project. And it's a joy when I can see audiences witnessing his work come to life.
And I would just add, Matt, that there's a unity to Pete's vision, that it's in the best possible way. Frankenstein feels like Corrie ten Boom feels like Scrooge.
Yep.
In ways that I wouldn't have known to think those were telling sort of the same story. I'm not putting that right, because it's not the same story, but there is a gospel infused vision of how the universe works.
Yeah.
That that informs everything Pete does. And
my goal has always been to put Corrie ten Boom and Frankenstein in the same narrative universe. So
it's the Pete Peterson cinematic universe.
But you know what? It's things that echo. It's you know, for many years at Studio 10, people were like, "What's the theme this year?" And I'm like, "I'm sorry, but I feel like Hope for the Broken is the theme every year." And I feel like that's kind of what you're tapping into too with Pete, is that he sees that truth, and as we dive deep into the humanity of characters, and when I'm directing and all of that, there is such a I always get worried to say the gospel in there, because that sounds like it's Sunday school class. It's not. It is truly a call for truth and the mystery of truth.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so many things that Pete and I talk about, the power of poetry, and we're not telling anyone anything. We hope we're drawing them closer to truths that they know, truths that are eternal, but not coming from me. You know, it's like, I'm not telling you what it is. But I think Pete does that time and time again. He draws us to the mystery, and that's where I love that as our source. That's our springboard every time we do one.
Yeah. I like the language of reality. Like, truth sounds like something that's I'm making connections in my head. Reality says this is out there, whether I acknowledge it or not.
Yeah.
And everything y'all do together, to me, feels like it's aligning me with reality. So listen, we can talk all day. I'm going to arbitrarily cut this off because we're already 20 minutes over my normal limit. I try to keep these to 40 minutes, and we're coming up on 1 hour.
Sure.
So I don't know any way to end this except to say we're done. Matt Logan, Pete Peterson, thanks so much for being here. This has been great.
Go see A Christmas Carol.
Go see A Christmas Carol.
Yeah.
Tickets available at rabbitroomtheater.com.
Great. That will be in the show notes for sure.
All right. Thanks Jonathan.
Everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
The Habit Podcast is brought to you by The Rabbit Room, where art nourishes community and community nourishes art. You can support their work, including this podcast, by becoming a member. Visit rabbitroom.com/membership. Special thanks as well to Taylor Leonard for letting us use her song Diamonds as the theme music for the Habit Podcast. You can learn more about Taylor and follow her work at taylorleonard.com. The Habit membership is a library of resources for writers by me, Jonathan Rogers. More importantly, The Habit is a hub of community where like-minded writers gather to discuss their work and give each other a little more courage. Find out more at thehabit.co.
If you've enjoyed this podcast episode, consider joining the Rabbit Room membership. Your membership helps sustain this community, funding everything from publishing and podcasts and theater productions to events and programs that support artists who create with a Christ-centered vision. We'd love to have you on board. Learn more at rabbitroom.com/member.